Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Northern Virginia Republican Business Forum. This is our third Zoom meeting. We miss all of you and can't wait to get back to our breakfast meetings and our evening gatherings. But for now, we're happy to see you and grateful that you could join us via Zoom. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce Mike Ginsberg, who is going to talk a little bit about SUV GOP and then the relationship with the forum. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Sherilyn. No, appreciate it. And thanks, everybody, for joining. I know this is a very busy week for a lot of people, so we really do appreciate you taking a little time to join us this evening on what I think is a very important topic. You know, I'm very excited to hear from our guest speaker, and I think it will be a very good presentation. SUV GOP has been in operation now for over 2 years. We've covered a lot of ground. We've instituted a lot of very new things that really are geared toward a suburban audience, because in addition to the millennials that we'll talk about tonight, that's sort of one component of a larger issue for the Republican Party in terms of the suburban vote. That's one component of the suburban vote that, quite frankly, we've had challenges with here, certainly in Virginia and, to a degree, throughout the party. I mean, when people start talking about how Texas and Georgia are in play, to the extent that that's true, I'm not sure that it's really true, but to the extent that they have gotten less Republican, it's probably because they have burgeoning suburbs that are to some degree moving away from the Republican Party. So our goal has always been to stem that tide and reverse it, to build up the Republican Party. And so we've done a lot of things over the last 2 years, potluck in politics. We've instituted a newsletter. We've gone door to door directly with candidates. We've hosted fundraisers. And then, of course, with, Ron and Sherilyn's leadership, we've taken over management of the Northern Virginia Republican Business Forum, where we marry Republican politics with suburban business folks. So we really have had a focus on that, and we've been very busy. Certainly the pandemic has put a little bit of a crimp in our style, but we've adapted. We have these great Zoom meetings. We're continuing to do the newsletters. We're continuing to reach out to new folks and to meet, new people coming in all the time. And of course, we're very active in Republican grassroots politics here as well. So we're really excited that, that all of you have joined us and have been a part of it almost from the beginning. And we really have made a lot of progress thanks to everyone. And I can't recommend the Northern Virginia Business Forum enough. I mean, they've had some great speakers. We've had Bob McDonnell. We've had Congressman Whitman. We've had Congressman Will Hurd. We had Bo Snerdley from the Rush Limbaugh program. We've had just a great set of folks, and I really can't stress how great it would be for you to join the meetings and the breakfast meetings that will restart when we have the chance. Let me introduce to you another friend of mine, a great friend of mine, somebody who's really got the pulse of the grassroots and is just a stalwart for the Republican Party. Thomas Turner is the chairman of the Young Republican Federation of Virginia, which is the leading organization, sort of leads all the unit committees that we have of the every unit, county, city has a Young Republican committee, and he is the leader of that organization. And he's just a great grassroots leader. He goes door to door. He goes all over the state. I mean, he's the consummate grassroots suburban leader. And so I'm really excited and so glad that he's joining us. And so without further ado, Thomas, take it away.
Thank you so much, Mike. I just want to introduce the guest speaker here tonight, Jonathan Jakubowski, who is the author of Bellwether Blues and is the Conservative Awakening with the Millennial Soul. He's also the director of SmartSolve, an award-winning startup business focused on sustainable packaging. He received his undergraduate degree from Bowling Green State University and a master's degree in public policy from Georgetown University. He is the founder of Champions in Action and is the chairman of the Forge Leadership Network Board of Directors. He is the executive committee chairman of the Wood County Republican Party and sits on the Wood County Board of Elections. So, Mr. Jackubowski, welcome to this forum tonight, and I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you for the kind introduction. It's really great to be with you. I'm really honored. When I got the initial invite from Ron, I was really blown away that you would find me all the way out here in Northwest Ohio to bring me to Northern Virginia. But I have to say I'm not unfamiliar with Northern Virginia. Since I lived in Northern Virginia for 2 years while in graduate school, it's a place that's near and dear to my heart and to my wife's heart as well. We loved Northern Virginia, and the reason we moved back to Northwest Ohio, which is where we're from, is because we were expecting our first daughter, and one of our goals was to get back around family. We both have pretty large families. We lived right off of Spout Run Parkway, if you know where that's at. We just talked about that's the Italian store and a few other places out there before the call. So I wanted to just make that note and connection, and also note how important the work is that you're doing. When I was in graduate school, I had no idea how important grassroots work is in the political framework. And obviously, Virginia has continued to increase its march towards blue, being a blue state. And we saw what happened in your state Senate. So your work could not be more pivotal and more important. And I wanted to give you great encouragement that the stuff that I'm hearing and what I'm seeing on this call is really great to see. And this is the kind of steps that you have to take. It takes a small committed group that's committed to something and that does it for a while to create change. And I really believe that these are the kinds of groups that make the greatest change in America and have for many, many years. So I wanted to start tonight by giving you a little bit of the outline of the book. And I know that a number of you have the book. Maybe some of you are going to be purchasing Bellwether Blues here in the near future. So I didn't want to bore you to tears with the details that perhaps you have already read or will be reading. But I thought you would enjoy hearing a little bit of the backstory and kind of some of the thought that went into the framing of some of the key issues as I analyzed the millennial vote. But before I do, I want to start with a quick story. I found myself last week at Ground Zero in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I was invited as a bipartisan commission with 5 white Protestant Christian Republicans and 5 black liberal Christians as well, brought together by this group called Philos, P-H-I-L-O-S. It's an organization that has done a lot of work in the Middle East on peacekeeping and peacemaking. And they were asked by African-American leadership to create a commission, a focus group that could go into Minneapolis and listen and learn. And I got to say, when I got there, I didn't have high hopes that there would be really any common ground that we could have with our 5 liberal colleagues. And I think what I found is pretty interesting. But as I sat there and at the place where that officer was on the neck of George Floyd for 9 minutes, and I encountered the deep pain and the hurt of many of the African Americans that were in that community. Our trip was led by a guy named Spike Moss, so he helped us really understand the pain of the people in Minneapolis and throughout the country. It was really an eye-opening experience for me, and I'm going to tie it to Bellwether Blues, and I'm going to talk about it at the end of my presentation here as I get into part 3. But I just want to tell you a little bit about Spike Moss because I think his story matters relative to the principles that I believe that the Republican Party and conservatives ought to stand for if we hope to win not only millennials, but those who might look differently from us. So let me say this. He grew up in the South in Missouri in the Jim Crow era. He is a civil rights hero. I think there's even a movie that's being made about him, but most of his fight has been up in Minneapolis. But the way he started his life was at the age of 9. He was playing baseball. His 2 uncles were in the Negro professional leagues because they were segregated baseball leagues. The black players had their league and the white players had their league. So he inherited some talent and skill from his uncles and was a part of a baseball team that was really, really good. And this young group of black kids, 9 years old, were winning all the games that they played against all the other black teams in the area. So there was a white team that was really good, and they invited the black team to come and play them on their field, on their baseball diamond. And they got to play in a diamond that was significantly better than what they were used to. And Spike talked about how the black team went in there and just was destroying this team. They were winning by 12 runs in the first couple of innings. Well, the white fans had enough of it, so much so that they ended up getting up out of their seats, grabbing bats, rakes, and shovels, and chasing 9-year-old black kids off of the diamond. Not only did they chase them off the diamond, they chased them away from the community, and the kids were running away while they're being chased by these adults with bats, being hit by bats. And there's a bridge that they had to cross over to get into their hometown that was now blocked off by a white guy with a truck. So these little kids went into the river and tried swimming across the river to get by the water moccasins and to get back to their homes. A lot of pain, a lot of tragedy, a lot of travail, and that was the lens through which Spike spoke to us and brought us into the story. So as I listened to that and was able to step into that pain and to really understand to a deep extent what was happening at ground zero in Minneapolis, it became all that more clear to me that if we are to be effective, it's not going to be through the political conversation with the left. It's going to be something that's much higher. The solutions to America's problems aren't going to be answered in our legislatures. They're going to be answered in the institutions of faith, family, and freedom. And I'll talk about that in part 3. So let me take you now back to Bellwether Blues and how the analysis started. In 2018, I had just accepted the opportunity to be a chairman of a local party here, of a county party. And I received a phone call from New York University where there was a professor who was doing investigation on swing counties in swing states. And he said, Chairman Jackubowski, did you know that there are 59 swing counties of 3,142? And that your county is one of those 59? I said, I had no idea. I knew we were, swing and we got extra interest, but I had no idea that our county was that significant in terms of its swing nature. He said, yes, it's those counties that voted for Bush 2000, Bush 2004, Obama 2008, Obama 2012, and then Trump in 2016. Only 59 remain standing that have that voting designation. I said, there's something special about that fact. So I thought that there might be something interesting to begin writing about. And as a millennial, I was really particularly interested in what happened with the millennial vote. My county, not only is it a swing county, it's the youngest of the 3 swing counties that remain in Ohio. And we are just about right on target when it comes to how we vote relative to the state of Ohio. And as you know, as Ohio goes, so goes the nation. So we were 8 percentage points for Trump in 2016. Ohio was 8 percentage points for Trump in 16. We were 4 percentage points for DeWine in 2018 for the gubernatorial race. Ohio was 4 percentage points for DeWine in the gubernatorial race. So there were these demographics about Wood County, my county, that make it incredibly unique and incredibly swing. So I wanted to dig deeper. And the book does an analysis of that, but the larger story that I'm talking about tonight, not so much the deep, detailed county investigation, but it's the analysis through empirical evidence that there are millennials that are leaving the left, that have had an effect in swing counties and swing states. And it's not that the millennials are necessarily leaving the left, as I point out in the book. It's that the left has left them. The left has gone so far to the left, and I use research primarily from the Pew Research Center, a center nonpartisan organization that talks a lot about political leanings and the political engagement of these parties. And as we know it because we see the policy platforms and the proposals that are being made by candidates for the Democratic Party. They have embraced a vision for America that is anti-American, that is unpatriotic, and a vision that would drive us into a realm of socialism unlike anything we've seen in decades. I mean, since the beginning of America, but certainly our enemies represented these things, and now all of a sudden it becomes something that we should embrace as Americans. Well, that abandonment primarily of the classical freedom, the tenets of classical liberalism, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, these were things that they stood for, the First Amendment. Remember when Democrats were champions of the First Amendment? I mean, think about the 1996 Religious Restoration Freedom Acts. Think about some of the policies that were in play when they defended the First Amendment vehemently. And now it's very different. There is not a defense of the First Amendment, it's a defense of an ideology. And if you speak out against that, now you are the problem. So you see that shift away, and that shift has left a lot of millennials who I think embrace freedom, who value freedom. As Americans, it's something that's in our anthems, it's in our DNA, it's what we stand for, it's what we believe in. These millennials felt abandoned by that. But at the same time, it's unthinkable to them to embrace the ideals of principled conservatism. It's unthinkable to them to vote with the Republican Party, the racist party. So we have them in the middle, and this is where the title comes from. I was in the living room with my brother-in-law, who is a staunch Democrat from Columbus, Ohio, very close. I appreciate him dearly. And we're able to have these great conversations where we agree to disagree. But in this case, I was explaining to him what I was finding empirically. And he said, well, I think what you're saying is millennials have the blues. And I said, yeah, that's right. They're skeptical, they're disillusioned, they're frustrated with the status quo. I think you're right. I think they have the blues. And the reason I titled it Bellwether Blues is because whichever party, whichever ideology is most effective at winning the millennial generation is going to avoid those same blues. As coined the Bellwether Blues. So that research led me to ask the question, well, millennials, okay, they're not voting with the right. Well, what happened in 16? Well, I think the best place to look is specifically in Wood County, because not all millennials are the same. The millennials on the coast, New York, California, those millennials are very different from swing county millennials who are in Central America. And thankfully, we still have an electoral college, which allows for smaller states to have influence and a voice in presidential elections. Were it not the case, you could forget about the millennials in, as they call it, flyover America. We'd have to go to the coast to find out what really matters. But because there's the electoral college exists, 11 to 13 states have all of these millennials who have a different perspective, a different approach to how they vote for the president and vote for those in higher office. So I looked at Wood County and I assessed the demographics that led Wood County to swing. And after I saw there being an effect and an impact that did demonstrate a shift from 2012 to 2016, I then wanted to use anecdotal evidence. So I got into part 2 of the book. And again, I'm covering over a lot of ground here. So hopefully in Q&A, if you have any questions, please feel free to let me know. I stepped into part 2, and there's nothing more powerful than a story. And I found a lot of stories of millennials who at one time voted for or supported Obama and then changed their voting persuasions to Trump. But there weren't many millennials that were willing to go on the record. They really feel the peer pressure, even here in Wood County, Ohio, way outside of the coast. There still is peer pressure to vote for the left of center candidate. Well, these millennials that I spoke to, the ones that were brave enough to allow their story to be told, have a fascinating journey to how their soul was awakened to say, yeah, I'm not only going to go from left to middle, I'm going to go all the way across to right. I'm going to vote for the Republican candidate. And in fact, about 5 of the 7 stories weren't really big fans of President Trump. They didn't really like the way he tweeted. They didn't like his story. They didn't like some of the crassness that they saw. They didn't like the way that he communicated. But what they saw in then candidate Trump were principles that they had now become to believe in, whether it was pro-life, whether it was the Second Amendment, whether it was a pro-Israel stance, whether it was principled ideals around the Supreme Court and those nominees. There were certain principles in each story that caused these millennials to swing their voting persuasion. In their own words, it was, I'm stopping voting for personality. I don't want to vote for personality. I want to vote for certain principles. I want to vote for things that are going to make a difference in my family and in my life. And I encourage you to check out their stories. They're very powerful. And by the way, there's this, I'll call it almost like a theology of intersectionality. And I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but it's one that you will become familiar with if there is a Democrat that gets into office. You know what it means, though. It's the idea that, even if you haven't heard the term, it's the idea that if you are a minority that has been oppressed in the history of America, you're at the very top of the rung. You are most important, deserve the most benefits. If you're a white conservative male, you're at the very bottom of the rung, and you owe the top of the rung everything you have to make sure that they are no longer oppressed. So it's identity politics to the core. And what these stories do is they prove that there are some demonstrations that there's a Blexit happening in America. There's a Lexit. There's these individuals that flip that intersectionality scale on its head and say, that's not necessarily the case with millennials in swing county America. So the stories are powerful, but from the stories, I learned something that I think is very important. And it's what informs part 3 of the book, which is where this is what my wife said after she read the book. She walked with me through it. And by the way, I never thought that I would be an author of a book. To me, it seemed too big and too impossible. But I had watched a John Maxwell leadership seminar. So for those of you aspiring authors, let me give you some hope. I didn't think I was going to be an author. As I was watching the seminar, he said that he wrote many of his books 15 minutes a day. I thought that was pretty impressive. I said, I can go to bed 15 minutes earlier and wake up 15 minutes earlier and then start writing something. So most of my book was 15 minutes a day. Yeah, there were weekends and there was extra time, and certainly the editing process was heavy, but I eventually got through something I didn't think that I could. So anyways, I digress. My wife, who was involved in this process and so kind and gracious in allowing me to take extra time on weekends and helping me walk through some of the thoughts and ideas, she didn't have a really full picture of what the book was about. So she started reading it, and she get through parts 1 and part two with all the stories. And then she read part 3 and she said, you owed that to me. I needed there to be some solutions, and you finally got something that I can practically take away from this. Well, the takeaway that I recommend, and the takeaway that she had, is what is most important and most influential at awakening the millennial soul is authentic relationship. I think we tend to, as conservatives, not only adopt the technology that the left seemed to demonstrate so well in 2008 and 2012, that I think our organizations have become much more tech savvy. We're using technology, we're leveraging it. Data is a big deal now in local races and state races and federal races. But I think part of the temptation in adopting the data is also adopting the tactics of the left, which are going to just destroy relationship. You berate somebody on social media because they don't think like you, act like you, or look like you. You go after them as hard as you can to make them feel inferior to you so your voice can increase. And unfortunately, I've seen a lot of conservatives adopting some of those tactics, kind of engaging in social media warfare. And I question the effectiveness of that approach. Now, I'm not saying that we don't need people that speak the truth, because we do. And we have people that speak the truth. I think Rush Limbaugh was mentioned a little earlier. Rush Limbaugh is somebody that continuously pursues to share the truth, regardless of what society might think about him. A number of members of Congress, like Congressman Jim Jordan, who's just south of us. These are people that go after and declare the truth. So we need these truth tellers. But this book's written for Mr. and Mrs. Conservative, who is at their home asking the question, what can I do to make an impact in this election and in future elections for younger generations? And I think the answer that I at least gained from the book and the evidence of these stories of millennials is the deeper relationship, the more relationship, or the depths of your relationship, as far as they go, the more currency of trust that you have with millennials, the more likely they are to hear you out. As you have currency of trust, you earn the right to be heard. And these millennials, there's one millennial, his name is Douglas, and he voted for Bernie Sanders in 2016 primary. In 3 months, he had another mentor in his life who came in and started building a relationship with him. And then 3 months later, he voted for President Donald Trump. That is quite a massive swing in only 6 months of time. But it was through authentic relationship that cultivated and developed a level of trust so that Douglas could ask the hard questions and could allow the walls to fall down to hear the principles of what his mentor was saying. So the delivery, the development, and the cultivation of authentic relationship is critical. And you're not going to get it through talking. You're going to get it through listening. Millennials like to be heard. There's so many things that we have all day, every day coming at us. Digital screens, computer screens, cell phones, social media content, communication from SMS. I mean, all sorts of things are coming at us from every which way that I think the value of authentic relationships has actually increased. Authentic relationship was a part of life. And when these screens weren't here, you had to have face-to-face conversations. Now those face-to-face conversations are much less, which means the human soul, which naturally yearns for human relationship and engagement, is desperate for those things. So I believe you as a conservative have a lot of value to offer. It's in your principled approach, but beyond that, it's also in the authenticity with which you approach life that I think millennials would love to yearn and would love to hear from you and learn from your life experience. So if you go into it saying, I want to invest in your life, I want to help you become all that you are created to be, I think over time, you're going to see that you're going to have an open door to sharing the principles of what you stand for and believe in. Now, this is the next point that's really important that I talk about in part 3 of the book in chapter 10, is you can get the door open, but if you don't know how to communicate why you believe what you believe, then you might not have the ability to persuade them. Once you bring them there, you got to be able to communicate effectively enough to lead them to vote in the right direction. My life's story is pretty symbolic in this. See, I was at Georgetown in 2008, and as you know, that was at the height of then candidate Obama's ascendancy to presidency. And at Georgetown, where 99.9% of my colleagues were big fans of Obama and were huge supporters of the Democrat Party, I was in the very small minority of people that was willing to vocalize my support for an alternative candidate. However, I didn't know really why I supported Republican candidates. I grew up in a Republican home, so just the way my parents voted is what really led me to really begin to think through, I guess that's just how I'll vote, because my parents voted that way. That's how I've been raised. Well, over the course of those couple of years, I began to see that the arguments that I had against the ideology that they were really well trained in and convinced of, I found that my arguments were found wanting. I didn't really have a good base to defend the points that I was trying to make against their points, which made me rethink my principles. I would say I went from being a solid Republican voter to an independent libertarian, almost to the point of moving over to becoming a Democrat. In fact, when we returned home, I was recruited to join the Democrat Party, and I actually considered that. But I really felt a level of dissonance, and I just couldn't quite make that leap because I wasn't certain that their ideology and their platform tied to the truths, those inalienable truths that made America what it became today. So I decided over the next 5 years, I would stay out of politics. I wouldn't do anything. I wouldn't step in. I wouldn't be engaged. I want to learn. I wanted to learn about the foundation, the truth. For me as a Christian, what matters most to me is the truth. And John 14:6 is one of the anchor verses for my life, which says, Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father except through me. So those anchor verses mattered to me, and I wanted to live life through the lens of truth. So I started to understand more about the colonial America, about the founding of America, about our founders and the writings and the philosophies and theories that led to the formation of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, which led to ultimately the abolition of slavery in 1854 with the Party of Lincoln. You know, all those stories culminated at the end of 5 years with me believing that that's the party I needed to participate in, was the Party of Lincoln, because the principles that are on our platform are most directly tied to the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which is where I think we find the cradle, the foundation for the Republican Party platform and the principles of conservatism. So that's what led me to really step in, and it was then that I started to be engaged, and then eventually I became chairman of the party. So not only do you have to develop authentic relationship, you must also cultivate that relationship with a strong conviction for why you believe what you believe. Bellwether Blues will give you some tips for how to do that. I think I just saw a quick question about what do I think about PragerU. I think PragerU is a fantastic resource. 5-minute videos that will give you a lot of principled ideas on questions, big questions that a lot of people have. And if you can go into these meetings with this millennial, let's say you invite them to coffee, in the first meeting you just sit there and listen. The entire time you listen and you ask questions. In the second meeting, they might start to ask you some questions. If you have PragerU as a resource, it's a pretty quick way to pull out some points that are salient to the conversation. So PragerU, I also recommend some books that you might be able to read and some other ideas for how to go about persuading the millennial soul. So once you have that why, then you have the chance, I think, to open the door for that millennial to step into an understanding of conservative principles and why they are the best principles for a flourishing America, for human flourishing for generations to come. And one thing I noticed, just stepping back, as I was writing chapter 4, which is about Tiffany Crane, a young woman who was pregnant. Her boyfriend wanted her to get an abortion. She ended up deciding life. She decided to give her ended up with them being twin boys, her baby boy's life. And that awakening of life led her to eventually become pro-life, which led her eventually to embrace the platform of conservatism. And as I saw her story, I was looking at the Harriet Tubman Memorial. And by the way, if you haven't seen the movie Harriet Tubman, I strongly encourage it. What a hero from our past, an amazing leader and individual that we should aspire to be like. Well, as I was looking at her memorial and listening and reading more about her life, what I saw was a parallel, a comparison. Harriet Tubman would take these slaves through the Underground Railroad and bring them north to freedom. I think the pro-life conviction is one of the most powerful ways to bring a millennial from the left underground to an awakening of the millennial soul. Pro-life convictions are powerful. They're scientific. And every millennial that I know that has had that awakening has begun to vote with different principles. So that's just an aside. What I want to do in closing, before we get to Q&A, is bring you back to Minneapolis. So as I was sitting there in the room with my friends, my liberal friends, who we had just spent a whirlwind tour of 36 hours with, meeting with pastors and community activists and people that were in incredible pain, people that had experienced police brutality. You know, it was told through the lens of a civil activist, and understanding to a deeper depth what was the pain that was being caused in Minneapolis. I had the question that remained: what is it that we can do to find common ground in this battle that we have that is raging in America? And the one thing that I found hopeful is, no, we couldn't find a political solution per se. Yeah, maybe at the micro level, there's some police reforms that I think we could go about. But what we found as a group is that we believe, and this is a Chuck Colson quote that you'll see in my book, is that politics flows downstream of culture. Now, I add an addendum to that in the book, and I say culture flows downstream of faith, family, and freedom. And the more eloquent we are in describing why those institutions matter in society, the more effective I believe we will be as the millennial generation grows in age and has children. Faith, family, and freedom. And even if, as I say in the book as well, even if somebody doesn't adopt the Judeo-Christian worldview of faith, that doesn't mean they can't be a fan, if you would, or a supporter of faith growing in America. Because we need those three ingredients for America to be successful. Os Guinness calls it the golden triangle of freedom. Faith depends largely upon the ability to express itself. It depends upon freedom. Think of Iran, think of North Korea. When they shut down their nation to faith, shut down their nation to freedom, it makes it difficult to be able to express faith. Well, virtue it needs faith, right? Virtue. To be a virtuous individual, we need a higher source that helps us follow the laws. And we know that a virtuous society is necessary for any society to flourish, any community to flourish. And I think virtue and family are synonymous. And I talk about that in the book. Family matters. And when we have many children growing up in homes without their father, that is the first indicator that they're going to have challenges in their life that are greater than others who do have fathers in their home. And then finally, we know that freedom depends upon virtue. When you lack virtue, when you see societies, as we see today, tearing up stores, looting and rioting, it means you have to increase the scope of power of government, and that reduces freedom. So those three things are interwoven and tied to the platform of conservatism, and they are the principles that I believe that will lead us over time to eventually win over a majority of the millennial generation in Swing County, America. And I note that a majority of the generation in Swing County, America. And those were the common ground things that we found with our friends in Minneapolis, is that through the church, through the Black church specifically, there's a lot of opportunities that we have to work together to help with those that are in situations of difficulty, those that are impoverished, those that are hurt, those that are in travail. And one of the pastors said this. He said, we were in a Black church, and our entire group of leaders from across the country came in, and he said, you don't have to tell me anything about the left. I know their tactics. I've been here for decades, and I've seen their oppression. I've seen the continued perpetual focus on entitlements and how that enslaves our people. You don't have to tell me that story. I know it full well. But I'm a gun-toting Second Amendment American, and I stood here and sent my men out to defend the only grocery store that we had remaining in our precinct that wasn't burnt down. They were out there defending it. But I can't talk to you because you've never heard me, Mr. Conservative. You haven't heard my cry. You haven't heard my pain. You haven't heard my voice. In fact, you're the first leaders that have come into this church, the first white leaders we've ever had sit inside of this church. So I think a big part of it is sitting at the table. It's listening to people. It's developing and cultivating authentic relationships. And through that process, I think we will see an awakening of the millennial soul. Well, I see a lot of questions, so I'm just going to ask Thomas. Thomas, do you want me to go through those questions one by one, or did you want to ask them to me?
I'm going to just give a few remarks, and then I'll let you answer them in your own way. But the first thing, I just want to say thank you again. That was great. One of the things I teach my federation and I go around the state is something that you talked about is being authentic. Having authentic relationships. I always say, are you willing to get beat up? And the reason why I say that, especially when you're going into different groups you've never been into, is there are misconceptions about the conservative movement. There are misconceptions that and you talk about it too in the premise of your book, is that we're racist, homophobic, and we can go on and on and on and on and on. And I think the question is, are we willing to hear those tough things and be able to give a response through facts, through policy, and through initiatives? So, that's the thing that I'm glad you hit on that one. But my question is to everyone on here, what advice would you give if they feel discouraged about that? Like they go to a couple of events, they get lambasted or they get attacked. How would you give them encouragement? Because I know for myself, being not just a millennial, but a double minority, I know what it's like to get beat up in these groups. I'm used to it. But for someone who's new, who says, I really want to try doing more outreach, just some encouraging thoughts for them.
Yeah, thanks for asking, and thanks for your example. It's greatly appreciated. What I would say is you all have in your life somebody that's a millennial who needs your investment, and they're close to you. You don't have to go to the heart of Antifa and find a millennial there and decide to transition them and walk them through an authentic relationship. And maybe somebody on here has that opportunity, but I think all of us have in our lives individuals who they might not be fully politically engaged. They might have some thoughts about mass media, but they're individuals who would really love for you to sit them down and say, hey, I just want to invest in your life. We all have them, and it's not that hard because we already know them. So I think if it has to be, it starts with me. And when it starts with me, I have a local network that surrounds me of individuals that I can immediately make contact with. Again, it doesn't have to be done way outside of your network. So I think the hope is right there. It's that you already have relationships right around you. Yes, it's not thinking as big, right? It's not thinking in scale. It's not thinking in mass. It's thinking deeper and it's thinking smaller, but it's going to have a much more profound effect on that individual's life. And if we have millennials across the country, if we have conservatives all across the country doing these exercises, making these investments, and to Thomas's point, finding ways to listen them out, hear them out, have some courage to hear the hard things. I mean, these people in Minneapolis, they were calling us everything. I mean, when they said you, they were pointing at me, talking about me being the white guy that has suppressed them and oppressed them. It was hard to listen to that. But guess what? I walked through that tunnel of chaos. I had those critical conversations, and now I've earned some relationships that will allow them to hear me out as I talk through why I think the political agenda that they're seeking to approach is the worst way to go about creating human flourishing for the Black community. But you have to go through some of that tunnel of chaos, and you already have that in your network. That would be my encouragement of hope tonight.
All right. Well, I'll let you go through some questions. I do want to read one from Mark Young. What would you say coming across to the right, or coming across to the right, are more conservative or libertarian?
Mark, thanks for the question. So who would I see coming across towards voting for Republican candidates? Is that accurate?
Yeah, I'll reword it. Would you say millennials are coming across to the right are more conservative, I guess more traditionally conservative, or libertarian in philosophy?
Gotcha.
I think it's a philosophical question.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think they're going to be more libertarian in nature, especially the ones that have voted for Democratic candidates. I think the thing that we have to be very proficient at and fluent at speaking about is freedom. Back to my point earlier that freedom is the reason why they're leaving the left. Well, freedom needs to be the reason why they embrace what we stand for. And we have a phenomenal example now as we look at all the states' responses to the coronavirus. Many of the millennials are feeling oppressed by the heavy hand of government, and they just don't know why. They don't always associate local government ruling with a political party or a philosophy and then tie that to a candidate in a race at a higher level. So I think we have to come forward with examples that demonstrate how their freedom is being oppressed because of a philosophy. It's not just the virus that's causing these guys to act differently. There's a philosophy that guides their approach to public policy making. And as that policy has guided them to really bring that oppressive hand, that's the kind of future we're going to live in if we allow left of center candidates to continue making policy for our lives.
John, that ties into a good question from David, which is a lot of millennials that he has met often have had a parent or grandparent or relative who came to America from a communist or socialist country. And they know from personal experience what socialism is like and that it doesn't work. How do those stories get out to other millennials who may have more idealistic notions about what socialism is?
Yeah, again, I mean, I know that we have platforms that conservatives are developing. There was one talked about tonight, PragerU. I know that there's people like Ben Shapiro that are out there gaining a voice. I know that we have our leaders speaking about it, but the most effective way is through interpersonal dialogue. Once again, once you get the walls to come down, they can hear you out. If you can hear them out and you ask really good questions, one of the things that I've found in dialogue is even if somebody doesn't want to hear me, but if I'm willing to hear them, they're going to talk. And they're going to talk their way to confusion because the worldview that they have and that they believe in, that there's some societal utopia that's tied to Karl Marx's theory is going to somehow benefit the group. I think that eventually they're going to find themselves tripping over their own words. And if you have a mentorship kind of relationship with them, that's not necessarily political per se, but it might be economic, it might be familial, it might be other ways that you're investing into their life. They're going to ask you questions through that process, and you're going to be able to make points. Like you said, this is a great example. I mean, Venezuela. And in the book, I talk a little bit about this. Doug's story. He was a flaming socialist, but through very good questions asked by a veteran, those questions led him to fully flip from socialism to pro-market capitalism. He works for a free enterprise organization today. So I think that's the key right there.
Okay. Ron Wright had a question, and actually, I think it's a great question because you mentioned this in your book, which I got and read last week as a Kindle book.
Thank you.
Which is the difference between liberalism and leftism, which and it's a very important distinction because we tend to talk about the two as if they were one. Can you discuss that and how that folds into some of the discussions we could have?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a really important distinction to understand. And I think as we describe leftism and we really give a face to the forces that are out there in the world today, seeking to wreak havoc on society, seeking to destroy the United States of America, it's really important to understand where that ideology comes from. And in Bellwether Blues, in chapter 1, in fact, you'll see, and even if you haven't bought the book yet, you can go online and sign up on MailChimp for I think our newsletter, and you'll receive an advanced reader copy, which includes chapter 1. I give 6 indicators that demonstrate the difference between classical liberalism and leftism. I don't want to take too much time, so I won't read them in depth, but what I'll say is this: the 6 are first race. Race, from the vantage point of all men are created equal, was the cause that was championed by Martin Luther King and many classical liberals. But leftism has embraced, as I mentioned earlier, identity politics. We have free enterprise and the idea of closed economies versus open economies. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and others, they would have fought for open and fair and free markets, at least certainly much freer than that which leftism now embraces with socialism. National sovereignty is a big deal. Leftists believe in a one world utopia with very little ability to have sovereignty over your own laws and your nation state. The view of America. Leftists believe America is evil. It is a slave nation. There is nothing good about America. It's the worst nation on the face of the planet. Classical liberals wouldn't have thought that or believed that. Free speech, as I mentioned earlier about freedom, they are now, and I use an example of like a baker that refused to bake a cake in the 1950s for the KKK would have been defended by the ACLU. Today, a baker who refuses to bake a cake because of their religious convictions at a gay wedding would be attacked by the ACLU. Very demonstrable distinction. And then Western civilization and the understanding of philosophical thought. Those are the 6 differences that I point out between leftism and classical liberalism.
Do you see the current sort of populist GOP under President Trump bringing young people into the party or turning them away? And what would the party need to do to move forward on this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's hard to determine the answer to that question. I think it's going to depend largely upon the forces of the left and what plays out. I think there are some millennials that really appreciate his style and appreciate the freewheeling approach of tweeting everything he thinks. And I think a lot of them believe he should have the freedom to do so. I don't think, from my experience of speaking with millennials, that they like the idea that you have big tech holding us down and just preventing us from having a free voice. They don't like that, but in the same breath, I also hear them complaining about the way that he attacks people, the way that he goes after them, the name doxing and calling. I see a dissonance there between the two, and it's not clear to me yet how millennials are going to respond necessarily to kind of the populist approach to gaining votes. But I think this is why it's the job of the Republican Party and those of us that believe that having President Trump in office, again, 5 of the 7 millennials in my book didn't necessarily like his personality. It was because there were principles that really led them to embrace voting for him because they knew that what he stood for was something that would improve their lives.
So from Ron, you mentioned coastal millennials. Do you think there are less relationship engagement? Is there less relationship engagement there as compared to Midwest millennials? I mean, I guess that gets into the heartland first, flyover country, as it's often pejoratively called, versus the blue coasts.
Yeah, I do. I talk a little bit in the book about how there is one example of unity between the far left and the far right. I define the far right not as alt-right, but far right as like no regulation, no government whatsoever. A government is an evil thing versus the far left with full government. And you look at it from the marriage of capitalism with apps that are now these apps that create free dating and like no bounds sexual engagement and sexual encounters. So you got these 30 somethings living in cities where the primary form of relational engagement is through a dating app with a one-night hookup. And there is some serious relational damage that has followed, and research demonstrates that. And I think you see a lot more of that on the coast than in the Midwest, or other areas throughout the country considered, as you said, use the term pejoratively, flyover country, where there are more authentic relationships that are still intact. A lot more families that remain connected.
I had a question. I mean, it ties into your very moving comments about your experience in Minneapolis. About the conversations you had and the stories that you heard. I think that many Republicans I know want to do something or reach out to people on race, but I think a lot of people are also kind of paralyzed. They don't know what to do. Perhaps they're afraid of a reaction, or they just don't know what to say. What would you say to people in terms of what we as ordinary Republicans can say or do, or just be, or to move forward on this, because if we wait for party leadership to act, we could be waiting for a very long time.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think it can be party-led. I think it needs to be led by individuals who care about other citizens, that care about their neighbors. I talk in the book about this thing called holistic freedom. There's positive freedom and there's negative freedom. A lot of the millennial generation understands negative freedom, which is freedom from something. I'm free from tyranny. I'm free from bounds and regulation. But I think we have to win them over by talking and living out the idea of positive freedom, which is what I'm free for. I am free for my neighbor to flourish. I am free to find ways to invest in my community. I'm free to help Black Americans who are struggling and suffering, to find ways to partner with them, to empower them. I think that from my conversations, I have a lot of Black friends from my history. Some of my best friends are African American, and I've been able to hear some of the stories. And the more that I've listened to them, the more I've found that together, they don't want to do this alone. They want us to come in with them and find ways to help overcome some of these significant and severe issues. And I'm sure on this call tonight, whether it's Thomas or others, they probably have firsthand experiences to help you see what you can do to step into these communities and help out. But to me, it all goes back to authentic relationship.
Okay, two last questions then. The first from Mark. What do you think are the top 5 policy areas that are key to millennials right now? And how could the GOP change to become more compelling to millennials in those
That's
areas?
a great question. Well, I'll answer that question by looking at the policies that were important to the millennials in the book, the 7 millennials here that I talk about. The first was pro-life, and being effective at communicating why, from the vantage point of the baby, why the pro-life position matters. Even if there's a libertarian millennial who's out there who really struggles perhaps with the argument between pro-choice and pro-life. If you can become communicative and persuasive as to why having some protections for the baby matters, that was one issue that I noted. As soon as they had embraced that and adopted that, it really changed their approach to voting. Number 2, I would say, is really understanding how federalism matters and explaining why having local governments that are accountable to the people, understanding why we want power to be devolved down to the local level. Right now, we look like an upside down triangle, with all the power at the top and less at the local level. And Virginia might not be what you want right now with some of the leaders you have, but I think generally speaking, we want to be effective at communicating why federalism matters. I think the third policy matter is also understanding what our legislatures can do to be effective in this policing conversation and in the race conversation. I think we need to become fluent at understanding why we must have police. We can't have the Ferguson effect happening. I don't know if you follow the Ferguson effect. There's people that have talked about it where there's more people that are being shot because of less policing, but neither do we want policemen that are going to be in these areas that are racist. So I think being engaged and understanding how we communicate effectively in those arenas really matters. Another area is the Second Amendment. I think gun sales and ammo sales are at record highs right now. So explaining why the Second Amendment, especially for women, really matters. When you have anarchist zones in places like Seattle and DC, we want the most vulnerable amongst us to have protection, and Second Amendment will give them that, right? And then the final one that I would just say is freedom and defense of one's ability to communicate their convictions. So this is kind of religious convictions. I looked at this in the cases they understood with church. For the one example I would give is like Lexington, Kentucky, where there were churches that were shut down, even if they had an outdoor service. Every car that went to that outdoor service with social distancing rules involved was forced to have to self-quarantine for 14 days, or they'd be ticketed or fined, or I think even imprisoned. I think as we can tell those stories as to how the leftist state is punishing religious organizations and preventing them from free exercise, I think that will help awaken the millennial to voting conservatively.
One final wrap up, and that is the question came in from Mark. Is there a way for folks to get in touch with you and engage with you on this in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. I do my best to try to respond. I'll give you my personal email address for the book, which is my first name, Jonathan, as you can see on the screen here, Jonathan@bellwetherbluesbook.com. One of the things that I learned first was how to spell Bellwether. I'd always spelled it like, the weather, W-E-A-T-H-E-R, but it's W-E-T-H-E-R. So www.bellwetherbluesbook.com. So Jonathan@bellwetherbluesbook.com, and I'll do my best to respond to you. If you have other places where you'd like to have me speak, or I don't know, just to talk to me individually, I would love to set that up. I'm truly honored and humbled that you would ask me to join this distinguished group of leaders in Northern Virginia. I'm for you and want to support you as much as I can.
Thanks, Jonathan. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Thomas, for doing the introduction. Sherilyn, you got anything else to add before the evening ends? We like to try to stay on the time limits. Everybody's got dinner.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. And we'll have another one of these Zoom meetings. Hopefully, as Sherilyn said, we look forward to getting together soon in person. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night.